Hello and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Jo Wheatley, and my friend and co-host Zoe Hawkins.
Hi, everybody. We're back today with another episode in our core coaching competency series. And today we're talking about maintains presence. And if you've listened to the others, you'll know by now that the ICF has a number of core coaching competencies that are there to help us to understand our practice and our behavior in coaching. And they help us to raise and maintain the standards of the profession. So that's the one that we're going to be deep diving into today.
Yeah, and maintains presence is the fifth core coaching competency for the ICF. And we're going to go through 5 different indicators around maintains presence today. They are: the coach acts in response to the whole person of the client. It's what they call the who of the client, the whole person. The coach acts in response to what the client wants to accomplish throughout the session. And that's what they refer to as the what, like the content. And then the coach partners with the client by supporting the client to choose what happens in the session. The coach demonstrates curiosity to learn more about the client. And the coach allows for silence, pause, or reflection. So those are the 5 that we're going to go through. But we thought we'd start initially by just talking a little bit more generally about presence in coaching.
Mhm. I mean, you can only really tune in and be present for your client when you're present for yourself. And so I think before you even start the coaching and the work that you may do with a client, for me, there is this calming and pause that you need to do for yourself to be able to take stock of, like, how am I today? Like, what's going on in my world? What do I need to be able to process, pause, or leave behind as I step into this coaching space? Because a lot of the work, certainly that I do now in coaching, can be intuitive. And so I need to know what's happening in my body, what's happening with my energy, what's happening in my mind, so that when I'm in a coaching session with a client and something comes up and I'm sensing something, I'm able to distinguish between what's mine and what's theirs. And I think as you develop your coaching skills over time, you'll start to pick up on those subtleties, the what is happening between you and your client, not just what's being said or what you're seeing in your client, but what's happening between you in the relationship. And I think so much of that is dependent on how well you know yourself and how tuned in you are to how you are in the moments before you start coaching. What would you say, Joe?
Well, I'm just looking at the word in front of me and I was listening into what you were sharing with our listeners there. And I was thinking about the makeup of the word presence, like pre-sense. So it's like,
Mm.
what are you sensing into as you were describing before you go into the session? And yes, I think there is becoming attuned to yourself. And sometimes it's about acknowledging that you may not be able to get complete calmness in your mind. You may still, it's a bit like when people try and meditate and they think, I can't because, I'm still noticing the noises outside. And you're always invited to, take that in and accept it and let it float through. And I think how does this show up in a session? If we were to think of it as like pre-sense, it's like before you flow naturally into the next question, get drawn into that. What are you noticing or sensing? What other information is available in the session? What are you noticing? Is there an opportunity to ask the client what they are noticing? Maybe even asking, what's present in this space right now?
I
So
do
you could
think there's a
even use, sorry, you can even use the word itself with your client and turn it into a question.
Yeah. And I was just going to say there, Joe, I do think there is a piece in coaching which is helping your client to be present. So when you're saying there about inviting your client around, right, what's happening for you right now, or what are you noticing? Presence is such a valuable, is it a tool? I was going to say it's a valuable tool, but a valuable skill, I think, to be able to notice just what you notice in those moments and almost let your subconscious bubble to the surface to be able to understand, what needs to be noticed, what needs to be aired, what needs to be witnessed, based on what you're discussing. So, yes, there's presence for self. And then I think there is enabling the client that you're with to be present. And on that, actually, something that just came to mind, there is an energy, I think, that is transferred. So if you arrive in a session with presence, with stillness, with calm, as much as you can gather in the moments before, it creates an environment for your client to be able to step into that for themselves. And I think that's where some great learning can happen. If you arrive with a slightly chaotic energy, or you're stressed, or you're literally busy rushing in, every chance that that energy is going to leak into your session, which isn't necessarily a problem. But if your client's arriving with a similar energy, it might take longer to sort of settle down into the session for you each to be able to find almost like a place to begin.
So let's kind of lean into the indicators that the ICF provide. The first one being that the coach acts in response to the whole person of the client. So when we think about the whole person of the client, we're thinking about, as Zoe saying, everything that shows up. So if, for example, you have agreed with the client in a chemistry conversation, maybe there's a pre-coaching questionnaire that you give them, but you've aligned on what the overarching goal is going to be. And yes, you will refine that in the first session. And, perhaps as you go through the sessions and new information comes up, but you think you know what's going to happen in this first session, or the client thinks they know what's going to happen. When they arrive in the session, and perhaps you ask a simple question, how are you arriving? How are you? Whatever your normal way is of starting a session or on that particular day. And the individual then does a download, if you like, of not only answering that question, but gives you quite a broad range of information. When we are working with the whole person of the client, we notice that, we reflect on it, we reflect it back to the client. It's also about calibrating what the client says with what you're noticing in their body language or their energy. It could be little micro expressions in their face. So you're going to check back in with the client around those things rather than going straight in, single-minded, focused on what the client said and being quite rigid or fixed in that. So it's having the flexibility and creating the space and having the patience, I think, to be able to enable the client to connect with and notice everything that they're bringing and what story that is telling and the relevance of that in terms of their overarching goal.
Mm. I think sometimes it may be easier to think. So if you look at number 2, it's the coach acts in response to what the client wants to accomplish in the session, the what. If all you coached was the what in a coaching session, it would be a very limiting conversation. So the what is, what do you want to achieve? When do you want to achieve that by? What do you think are the obstacles you'll need to overcome? And that is effective. It will get your clients somewhere. But the who brings in all the other dimensions. Like, how do you feel about that? What are you noticing in your body when you think about achieving that goal? It's the richness, I think I describe, of a coaching session.
When I think, my response, my whole body response to you, and you said, if we had a session just focused on the what, I'm like, that would be soulless.
Mm.
That's how I feel when I think about just a what. And I think it's almost more akin to the conversations you might expect to have, traditionally, maybe with a manager, that's focused on like KPIs and, it's more of that you're a number, you're a cog. It's almost anonymous. Whereas, the what responding to the whole person, the uniqueness, the individuality of the person in front of you, that's what creates the connection. And that connection, I think, is the pathway to doing potentially much more transformational coaching. What I mean by that is doing work that's going to serve them, not just in terms of the immediate goal that they have, but actually the broader things in their life now or the things that they might encounter in the future.
Yeah, I think when you bring in the who balanced with the what, it's a learning about who am I and what do I want? As you said, Joe, like, yes, what do I want right now? But what do I want for the future? And how might my actions today influence who I am becoming or what I want to become? So it's a much more holistic journey when you coach both the who and the what. And so both of those dimensions are important.
And if you're going through performance evaluation or you're doing performance evaluation for ICF accreditation, they look for the who and the what. You do need to demonstrate both in your questions, in the way that you are in the session.
Mm. I think something I would say around the what, that piece. So a coach acts in response to what the client wants to accomplish in this session. So firstly, I mean, there's the very basics around it's what the client wants to accomplish. So you may have some great ideas when you hear the client sharing their initial challenges, what they want to focus on. When you're certainly a beginner coach, you can start to think, oh, that would be great for the client. Like, I wonder if they've explored this, that, and the other. So it's making sure that that stays out of the coaching session. And I think it's also around helping the client, as we alluded to there, is look at the short, medium, and long term. So, like, what do they want to accomplish today? And why is that important? So, how does that connect into what they're trying to achieve in the longer term? So, help your client to almost expand their vision of what it is that they want for themselves, and then come back into the here and now. And what that enables the client to do is almost like build the energy for the journey that they're going to go on. Now, sometimes it might be appropriate that the client focuses on only those short-term goals. Perhaps there's too much overwhelm when they step out into the future. And so you might purposefully be doing the opposite and helping the client strip it back into what's the first step that you can take. But I think that piece around the what, there is an intricacy to that as well in helping the client to really articulate and I was going to say envision, but not all clients are visually motivated. So it may not just be about vision, but to really be able to describe in the senses that are important to them what it is that they are trying to achieve.
And in 1 and 2, you'll see the first part starts the same. Coach acts in response to. And that in response, I think, is really important. So there's a balance here between being responsive to, where the client is going in their thought process. And, those of you that are listening, I certainly can relate to this. I can start at point A and think, "Right, this is what I want to achieve." But I'm really used to kind of following my flow of thought, and new thoughts come up, and I enjoy that process. But I might really benefit from my coach actually just getting me to pause at a certain point in that journey. So not it's that balance between not interrupting my flow, but sometimes needing to interrupt that flow in order to just check that where we're going is a good use of our time, and it's serving my goal. And it might be that my goal is slightly changing as I'm developing my thinking. So you've got to be responsive as a coach. You can't stick to your script. You might have done a lot of preparation for the session based on the conversations you've had with your client, but also you have a role to check it back into the original contract that you had, what you agreed to do. So it's being able to go with the client where's useful, and checking regularly that it is useful, and also just checking where are we in relation to the original goal that you had for this session. And if the client says, yeah, I don't think that's what I need to work on, actually, now that as we're having this discussion, I'm realizing this. And then your role as the coach is to say, okay, so what does success look like in terms of the remainder of this session? And how does that relate to the original overarching goal that you wanted to achieve during the full course of the coaching program? So it's being able to really develop those muscles of balancing your curiosity, not letting it go completely wild. So being curious with the client and creating that space where they can be curious about themselves and their thinking too, and also holding that container that they've asked you to hold for them for the
Mhm.
program.
Yeah. And so the next indicator is coach partners with the client by supporting the client to choose what happens in this session. And I think this is a really important one. So there's the goal, which we've talked about. So the client obviously chooses the goal. But there are moments in coaching sessions where the client can share different pieces of awareness. And sometimes you, as the coach, are sat there and you're like, all of those avenues sound interesting. Which one shall I inquire into? And in those moments, ask your client. So I hear you've said X, I hear you've said Y. Which of those would you like to explore? Or is there anything else that's coming up for you? So much in coaching and in training coaches, we see learners taking responsibility for the client's outcomes and feeling a sense of pressure around the results that the client gets. And I think it comes down to this piece, which is sometimes the coach can be making too many decisions in a coaching session around where to inquire and where to go. So do you remember that your client is in control of the session. You are the facilitator of the journey, but it's your client that gets to make those decisions.
Yeah, we'll often hear clients say things like, so if the coach, you as the coach say, and how would you like to address that? Or what would you like to do in the session to make progress against that? And the client will say, I don't know. And for some people, that's just it's a phrase that comes out of their mouth without even thinking, do I know or not? It's an automatic response. So as a coach, we're trying to sense into what have we heard? What do we know about the client? Is it that automatic response? Do we need to create that space for them to really think about what they know? And other times they'll say, what do you normally do with clients? And we're thinking that's a really interesting question to ask. Like, to what extent does it matter what you do with other clients because you're in this unique relationship with the client in front of you? And sometimes the client might say, oh, I don't know, I'm not very good at making decisions about things like this. That is that's a hook, really. That tells us something more about the client's experience or perception of themselves in the world that they're in. And how does that indecision relate to or impact the goal that they want to achieve? So that is often can be, like a sideways door into it. So you don't then fall into the trap of taking the responsibility for the session. Instead, you use their answers and their response to offering them the driving seat, if you like, to be able to work towards their goal as well, related to their goal.
I think there is, though, something in coaching. I think you alluded to it there, Joe, where sometimes coaches do know what's going to help a client. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, you're working with a client who doesn't know what they want to do for their career direction. Now, as a coach, you know that helping the client to understand their values is likely to ignite insight and
Yeah.
awareness for that client that's going to help them along the way. And so this piece around, letting the client choose would look maybe slightly differently in that you'd arrive in the session and you'd say, what would you like to focus on today? And the client might say, oh, I don't know, like I still want to explore my career direction. Okay, I have an invitation for you. This is values. This is what values are. We could spend some time doing this. How does that sound? And the client might say, oh, I don't know. What else could we do? So there may be some kind of offer and acceptance or offer and decline that sort of happens, but I think it's the spirit in which you invite your client into it. So it's not a do to, it's not a in this session we're going to do your values. It's a here's something that I could offer. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. And it always comes back to impact, doesn't it? So it's about making an informed choice. So knowing, well, if we did that, what would that involve? What might I get out of that? How might that be useful to me? What would the impact of that be? And you'll have had a chemistry conversation with the individual. And during that conversation, often a client will ask, how do you work with coaches? What do you tend to do? So those questions are often discussed in that chemistry conversation. So they'll have an idea that you'll often do values for this reason, or you'll often do beliefs for this reason. So when it's mentioned again in the session, they've chosen to have coaching with you because they feel that that's going to be useful for them. And it's often, the relationship changes, I think, is important for us to note here. The relationship between the coach and the client changes as you have a number of sessions together. And as the client learns about what is coaching, how is it best for me to use the time that we have together? Because at the beginning, they probably don't know.
Mm.
But as they learn how you are, how they are together, what is most valuable through that relationship, they'll start to take more ownership naturally of the coaching relationship. So there is that bit of, as you're saying, around meeting the client where the client is at. And um, if we were talking about the EMCC, we were, in their competencies, we might be having a slightly different conversation around where we meet the client and where we take them to. But there is flexibility within this to acknowledge that the relationship will likely deepen over time. So, but the main word, if we were to go through and highlight some of the words in each of these phrases, for this one, it would be a choose.
Mm.
That's critical. And when you're reflecting on your coaching generally as a coach, Maybe you're looking for prompts sometimes, thinking, I don't, what shall I reflect on today? This might be something for you to do that around. What choices do I enable my clients to make in coaching sessions? What is my blind spot or what is my watch out in terms of the choices that I make for my clients? And how clear am I articulating that to my clients in the chemistry conversation or in the coaching sessions we have together?
Mm. So the next is the coach demonstrates curiosity to learn about the client. And I think
Mm.
this is a watch out because you aren't there to learn about your clients like life, so it's not like, oh, what's your favorite TV program? How's your kid today? Like, how do you feel about your boss? Like, it's not that kind of curiosity to learn about the client. Um, and it's not curiosity to learn about the story or what did he do then? And what did you say next? Like, that is not what this indicator is getting at. It's about you bringing curiosity to what the client is sharing to ignite and enable their learning. So you might bring curiosity to something your client responds to. And I think we said earlier, like there can sometimes be a disconnect between what the client says and the energy that they say it with. You might bring curiosity to that. Oh, I noticed that you said that you really want to apply for your promotion. And yet I sensed when you said that there was some hesitancy. Like, what do you think about that? That's the level of curiosity that we're bringing. It's not curiosity about just stuff that the client brings. It's curiosity related to what the client is trying to achieve so that you can help and support them. So you might be looking at patterns, themes, emotions. It's those sorts of things that you're bringing your curiosity to.
When I think about this indicator, I think about evidence of you bringing your curiosity and honoring this particular competency is the client's response might start with, it's like the curiosity around things that are not currently in your client's awareness. And so that's what clients are coming to coaching for, is they're often trapped looping around in the ways they normally reflect on things and they feel stuck in their own model of thinking, feeling, and they're coming to coaching to get new perspective. So the curiosity is if the client has been talking all about, I think this, I think that, and there's a real dominance or bias, if you like, towards thinking over feeling, for example, you might then ask a question and say, I hear you share that you think this and you think that. I'm wondering what you're feeling about this. And then the client goes, hmm. So the curiosity is because you as the coach don't know. And maybe the curiosity is your sensing that your client might not know. And so you're curious uh, what might develop or what might be helpful to them if they were able to make contact, get in touch with that. So yeah, I agree. It's not about going down a rabbit hole. And feeling that you can't really start coaching until you know everything about the client and handcuffs around that. I think this is more around the environment that you create, the psychological contract that you have with your client, so that the client doesn't feel the need to filter what they're going to say in the session because they know it's going to be met with curiosity rather than judgment.
And you want the client to get curious about themselves, so I think by you role modeling that curiosity, it sort of rubs off in the relationship as well.
And there's a lightness. I think curiosity can bring a lightness when done well. So if you respond as the client and say, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. It's light. You can kind of, the client can speak without filtering, and then you can kind of reflect together on what's been shared during that time. You're still aware as the coach around what are we working on together. You'll know why you're asking that question and the purpose of it. So yeah, that's a lovely one. And the final indicator for maintains presence that we're going to look at today is the coach allows for silence, pause, or reflection.
Yeah.
They're,
I mean,
they're three big things just slid into that point there.
they are big, but they're also inherent in coaching, aren't they? I think, we've talked before the client does most of the talking. So there should be silence from your part in the coach. But I think the piece that I would draw attention to is when you are coaching, you do not need to have your next question lined up, ready to go. It is absolutely okay if you ask a question, your client finishes sharing their answer, and you don't yet know what to ask next. And that can be a moment for pause, for reflection. You yourself, as the coach, reflecting on what the client's just shared and letting a question emerge from that space. So, silence, I think silence and using it is an intuitive thing. It's like sensing into how much space does my client need. And you can look at your client, and sometimes the eyes will be diverted off and they'll be looking out the window, and like you can see that they're reflecting. So that's a moment for pause and silence. Or if they're done and they're sort of looking at you and you're sensing, I think there's more, just holding a few moments of silence to see if there is any more, but also contracting with your client around how comfortable are they with silence, and is that something that is useful to them. So these are skills in themselves that you learn on as part of your coaching training. You spend a lot of time building core skills, so you can't take for granted silence, pause, and reflection as things that just are given. Actually, they are skills like everything else that take time to build.
I think permission comes up here as well. I think sometimes we're so used to, in our everyday lives, immediacy, the expectation of responding. So, you might find in your own homes or houses, you get asked something. If you don't respond straight away, then the other person's going to say, "Did you hear me?" Or, "So what do you think? What's your answer?" And it's almost like big eyes, like even my eyes now as I think about that, it's like, oh my gosh, like just give, I need a moment to think about that. But there's an expectation generally for speed. And I think coaching is a space where we can enable clients to slow down. And I think part of that is enabling their nervous systems to calm down so that they are able then to, make contact with their intuition, with their deeper sense of knowing who they are. So as a coach, when it comes to permission, I think there's something in the chemistry conversation, maybe at the start of a session, at any point during it. Say, if at any point in our conversation you feel the need, you just need a bit more space to process something, please just say, or take the time, and I'll be looking for those indicators from you that you need that. And of course, you can translate the pause or reflection into questions. I often do in my coaching. Sometimes I'll say, let's pause for a moment. And that's usually because I'm feeling a sense of we've covered a lot of ground. So if I'm coaching someone for an hour or an hour and a half, there's a lot of words that are being exchanged. And people need time to process. And also to be able to kind of reflect on things, I think, like from a 360. So that would be an example of a phrase there around pause. And when it comes to reflection, I might say, what are you reflecting on? So if the client is taking some time and have given them that time, then a way to invite them to rejoin in that way in the session might be, what are you reflecting on? Or what are your reflections so far? Or what would you like to reflect on from what we've discussed so far? Those kind of phrases can really help with that. And they would be obvious indicators in terms of what you're doing as a coach, that you're honoring that particular um, competency indicator.
So that's maintains presence. As you can see, a really rich competency and a core piece of coaching to be able to enter into that space with presence and to facilitate presence with your client. And if you're listening to this podcast and any of the others and thinking, oh, that sounds like a skill I'd love to develop, then do come and check out our courses that are available at igcompany.co.uk.